Well, good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are in the world. My name is Aaron Brody from the Badè Museum of Pacific School of Religion, and I want to welcome you back to our new perspectives on ancient Nubia series. And before I have the pleasure of introducing our guest speaker for today, I want to yield the floor to our curator, Melissa Craddock, who will read our land statement.
Thank you, Aaron. Hello, everyone, and welcome. We would like to start by acknowledging that Berkeley, California is on the territory of the Huchiyun, the ancestral and unceded land of the Chochenyo Ohlone. We respect the land itself and the people who have stewarded it throughout many generations, and we honor their elders, both past and present. There is no question that our society is poised at a moment of change. We see it when fellow Americans are unjustly detained, when our citizens are wrongly harmed, and when our communities are in the streets for months on end protesting in order to be heard. The Badè Museum of Biblical Archaeology and Archaeological Research Facility, ARF, at UC Berkeley, wish to acknowledge the pain and outrage of our community members who bear the weight of existing in a society designed to work against them and who feel the devastation most keenly. Here at the museum and at ARF, we have been moved by the courage of those most deeply affected and the tenacity of those protesting for change. The Badè Museum and ARF stand in solidarity with the African American community. We join you in your calls for justice. Collectively and individually, our staff condemns the police brutality and systemic racism that has long been enacted against the Black community and other communities of color. It has persisted for far too long. It has resulted in the unjust and premature ending of lives. So let us say their names: Breonna Taylor, Tony McDade, Ahmaud Arbery, George Floyd, Tamir Rice, Trayvon Martin, and countless others. Let us as organizations be perfectly clear: Black lives matter. We lend our thoughts and actions to those who, every day, actively work to make this statement a living, breathing ideal, and to those who continually live the reality of racial injustice. Likewise, we lend our expertise to the cause by incorporating BLM-sensitive material into our exhibits, programming, and curriculum. We know very well that this moment has been a long time coming, and we are in the fight for equality, justice, and accountability. Through this lecture series, we aim to raise awareness of ancient Nubia, a vibrant region in Northeast Africa with a rich archaeological and historical legacy. Learning about the ancient peoples of Nubia is one way to decenter the usual academic focus on Egypt and biblical and classical lands in order to reconceptualize the past. Decolonizing our views of the past, as through the research presented in the New Perspectives on Ancient Nubia series, we hope will lead to a more just present and equitable future. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Melissa. So it is my great pleasure today to welcome Dr. Kevin Burrell, who is Assistant Professor of Old Testament at Burman University in Alberta, Canada. Dr. Burrell has a BA from Canadian University College, an MA from Trinity Western University, and his PhD from Stellenbosch University in South Africa. He has excavated at Tel Umeiri, part of the Madaba Plains Archaeological Project, and at Khirbet al-Balua, part of the Balua Regional Archaeological Project. Both of those are in the modern Jordan. His recent publications include Kushites in the Hebrew Bible, Negotiating Ethnic Identity in the Past and Present, Burrell, Representing Kushites in the Hebrew Bible, an article in the Archaeology. Dr. Burrell's presentation today is entitled Kushites in the Hebrew Bible. So welcome, Dr. Burrell, and I'm happy to cede the floor over to you, and we look forward to it.
Thank you very much, Dr. Brody. Just sharing my screen here. Thank you for the invitation to be here, to be part of this lecture series. I have thoroughly enjoyed being here. Let me just share my screen. Sorry. Okay, hopefully everyone can see that. I have thoroughly appreciated the depth and scope of scholarship that has been presented over the last several months, and just for putting Nubia on this platform, bringing Nubian scholarship forward in this high-profile platform. It's been really appreciative. I appreciate the Badè Museum for what you're doing in terms of your focus on social justice, indigenous rights, Black Lives Matter. I think all of those things suggest to me a very meaningful way to bridge the past and present to make scholarship relevant for our present social climate. So I appreciate very much what the Badè Museum is doing here. I'm an outlier in this lecture series. Unlike the other presenters, I do not study the Nile Valley directly, but rather indirectly. I depend on the work of Nubiologists and Egyptologists to inform my view of ancient Nubia. Still, when it comes to understanding the Kushites in their ancient context, and particularly beyond the Nile Valley, I believe the Hebrew Bible is an important conversation partner. This corpus of texts present an important perspective on how the ancient Kushites were perceived and characterized by an external culture. Amos 9:7 presents a most tantalizing comparison between the Israelites and the Kushites. Are you not like the Kushites to me, O Israel, declares Yahweh. William Harper's commentary on Amos provides the following explanation. Israel, says the prophet, is no more to me than that far distant, uncivilized, and despised black race of Ethiopians. No reference is made to their Hamitic origin or their black skin, and yet their color and the fact that slaves were so often drawn from them added to the grounds for despising them. In his view of the Amos text, James Mays writes, on the evidence, one can say no more than that the Kushites were a distant, different folk, whom the Israelites knew mostly as slaves. You are to me, says Yahweh, as these Kushites are to you. What the comparison does is to humiliate Israel completely, to reduce them to the role in Yahweh's order of things, which the Kushites played in their own society. The implication from Harper and Mays is clear. Negroes in ancient Israel were associated with slavery in as much as they are in modern society. Numerous other examples of this type could be provided because the view that Kushites were known to the Israelites mainly as slaves, despised for their race and color, distant, insignificant, or unknown, prevailed in biblical scholarship well into the 21st century. Not only so, but scholars for a long time misidentified ancient Nubia with present-day Ethiopia or even present-day Libya, attesting to the lack of serious investigations into the ancient Kushites. And until quite recently, it was routine for Kush to be excluded from maps of the biblical world and even dictionaries dealing with biblical peoples. To be fair, more recent commentaries generally take a more moderated and even positive view of the Kushites in passages like Amos 9:7. But older views are still very much influential because the bulk of these older commentaries remain on library shelves today. Thus, the trope of the servile African was, and still is to a good degree, characteristic of biblical interpretations involving Kushites. This, of course, was true of a number of other disciplines, including those disciplines concerned with the study of the Nile Valley. Biblical scholarship had essentially uncritically accepted many of the interpretations coming out of Egyptology and correspondingly reflected much of the biases inherent in an earlier generation of Egyptological studies. Fortunately, a new group of scholars, as this lecture series attests, are contributing to the dismantling of many of these older, essentially racist views. A number of African American and African scholars have also done valuable work in helping to correct distorted perceptions of Kushites in biblical studies. Among the foremost, Charles B. Cofer stands as a pioneer. Others, such as the African scholar Tuesday Adamo and the African American scholar Rodney Sadler, have all made valiant contributions. My goal today is to explore both the theological and historical dimensions of Kushite representation in the Hebrew Bible, drawing upon a select few texts. Cushion-related terms occur about 56 times in the Hebrew Bible, 62 if we consider the occurrence of the root Cush in certain compound names. While the majority of these references denote ancient Nubia, the Hebrew Bible is also conscious of an Eastern provenance for Cush. This is most clearly shown in the genealogy of Genesis 10, with Nimrod, the descendant of Cush. According to the text, Cush fathered Nimrod. He was the first to be a mighty warrior on the earth. He was a mighty hunter before Yahweh. Wherefore it is said, like Nimrod, the mighty hunter before Yahweh. The beginning of his kingdom was Babel, Erech, and Akkad in the land of Shinar. From that land he went into Assyria. He built Nineveh, the city of Rehoboth, and Kala and Rezin between Nineveh and Kala. That is the great city. Scholars have had a difficult time situating Nimrod because without a doubt, his provenance is Mesopotamian. Nimrod is associated with Mesopotamian place names such as Babylon, Uruk, and Akkad, with Assyrian cities like Nineveh and Kala. These toponyms are located, of course, in present-day Iraq, clearly east of Israel. From the picture in the Hebrew Bible, Kushites under Nimrod have a formative role in the post-Diluvian world. Nimrod is the post-Diluvian father of kingship, urbanization, militarism, and empire. He's the first post-flood king, the founder, as it were, of Mesopotamian civilization, and the first empire builder. Nimrod is also said by the text to be a mighty hunter, again emphasizing his physical prowess. There's an old tradition of great hunters in Mesopotamian sources. From the Old Babylonian to the Neo-Assyrian period, numerous depictions of valiant warriors engaged in the hunt are found on seals, reliefs, and in texts. Such depictions may attest to a long-standing tradition of associating legendary heroes with hunting, lending credibility to the Hebrew Bible's depiction of a great Eastern hunter warrior king. Since Nubian Kush is the focus of this talk, I will digress only very briefly to suggest that there's plausible evidence to support the Hebrew Bible's view of an Eastern provenance for Kush. In the 2020 volume, I argue at length that the tradition of an Eastern Ethiopia or India in classical sources and the land of Meluhha in Old Babylonian sources lend credibility to the Hebrew Bible's Nimrod Kushite tradition. There is a land appearing in Old Babylonian sources from about the middle of the 3rd millennium BC called Meluhha. Meluhha is also called the Black Land in several sources. I'll just give one example here. In the Curse of Agade, an Old Babylonian text extolling Naram's sin of Agade, the following is observed of the inhabitants of Meluhha. The Meluhites, the men of the Black Land, brought exotic wares down to him, that is, to Naram's sin. From the totality of the evidence, scholars suggest an Eastern provenance from Meluhha in the 3rd millennium BC. While many scholars identified Meluhha specifically with the Harappan culture of the Indus Valley, others envision a much wider geographic area for Meluhha, from Elam all the way into the Indus Valley. I.G. Gelb, for example, says 4 pieces of evidence based on conquests place Meluhha close to Mesopotamia, specifically in Iran, east of Elam and Ansab. The evidence concerning the lapis lazuli, the sisu tree, and the black people of Meluhha, corresponding to the Ethiops of classical times, place Meluhha between Iran and Afghanistan. The farthest extent of Meluhha in India is indicated by the imports. Again, time does not permit us to explore further evidence regarding this eastern land of Meluhha, but I point to Meluhha in Old Babylonian sources because there is also another Meluhha, a western Meluhha, specifically Nubia, mentioned in the sources from the middle of the 2nd millennium BC. In the Amarna letters, for example, which date from the 14th century, Meluhha clearly refers to Nubia, over which the Egyptian pharaoh exercised control. Likewise, in the 1st millennium BC, Neo-Assyrian kings used Meluhha and Kush interchangeably to refer to Nubia. For example, according to Ashurbanipal, on my first campaign, I marched to Makan and Meluhha. For a second time, I took the direct road to Egypt and Kush. Esarhaddon as well, in his annals, refers to the black Meluhans of Kush. Thus, 2 lands known as Meluhha, identified in ancient Near Eastern sources, one in the east, the other in the west, both associated with black peoples. This tradition is also ubiquitous in classical sources, from Homer, who said the Ethiopians dwell sundered in twain, the farthest of men, some beyond the setting sun, others beyond the rising sun, to Herodotus, who writes, the Ethiopians above Egypt and the Arabians had Arsames for commander, while the Ethiopians of the east, for there were 2 kinds of them in the army, in Xerxes' army, served with the Indians. They were not different in appearance from the others, only in speech and hair. The Ethiopians from the east are straight-haired, but the ones from Libya, Africa, have the woolliest hair of all men. Notably, Herodotus identifies two groups of people, similar in appearance, except for their hair and speech, one Eastern, the other Western. A long tradition identifying Ethiopians with Indians and vice versa extends from classical times even into the modern period. In summary, classical ancient Near Eastern sources and the Hebrew Bible are conscious of a tradition of two lands, East and West, both associated with Black peoples. Thus, the Nimrod tradition of the Hebrew Bible may plausibly embody historical memory of an archetypical personage, a warrior king from the East, known for his great feats. The Hebrew Bible is, of course, a theological document, and therefore it is fraught with theological concerns. It is impossible, I believe, to understand how images of Cush are functioning within the framework of the biblical text without fleshing out the theological underpinnings of representation. So let's take a second look at Nimrod from a theological perspective. What does the Hebrew Bible want us to know about Nimrod and his Eastern Kushites? We begin with Ham's genealogy in Genesis 10. In the process of constructing difference in the Hebrew Bible, in the primeval account of Genesis, Hamites become the outgroup, the othered. But as Robert Cohn has emphasized, the otherness of the Hamites is not biological, not racial, not written in the nature of things, but rather moral, the result of human choices. Hamite's descendants are judged and othered based on moral and religious premises. The in-group, the descendants of Shem, specifically the Israelites, have a right relationship to Yahweh, while the outgroup, expressly the descendants of Ham, are characterized by moral religious failings. Thus, Noah's curse on Ham, vicariously applied to his son Canaan, is a moral religious indictment, not only of Ham, but of all of Ham's progeny. Hence, in the context of Genesis, Nimrod is a moral religious other, just like his forebearer. Though credited with the beginnings of urbanization, civilization, and military supremacy, those things which normally elicit encomium, Nimrod and his Kushites are not celebrated by the writers of Genesis. These actions are an affront to Yahweh's legitimate rule over the earth. Nimrod is connected to Babylon, the seat of idolatry and self-will. By being associated with Babel, Nimrod and his Kushites, by extension, are implicated in rebelling against divine authority. Nimrod's Babylon becomes the archetypical enemy of the people of Israel, imperious and overweening. Nimrod is also connected to Assyria and Nineveh, not only idolaters, but also oppressors of Yahweh's people. Theologically, then, Nimrod is negatively appraised. Even the name Nimrod is derived from the Hebrew verb marad, to rebel. He stands in opposition to Yahweh, charged with hubris in the exaltation of human achievement. From the perspective of the Genesis author, Nimrod is not a hero, but rather an imperial usurper. In brief, the Nimrod story is a critique of imperial ambitions. As far as the Hebrew Bible is concerned, Nimrod's claim to universal sovereignty is illegitimate. Yahweh is the sole and rightful universal sovereign. As we turn attention to Nubian Kush, we will see that these same theological concerns apply to characterizations of Kush. Though the Hebrew Bible is conscious, as I've said, of an Eastern Kush, especially within the primordial context of Genesis, it is Nubian Kush which garners the attention of the biblical writers. Beginning with Nimrod, the Hebrew Bible associates Kush with both antiquity and military strength. Nubian Kush is also employed as a topical symbol for military power. In the Hebrew Bible, Kushites are most frequently mentioned in contexts of war, often in alliance with Egypt, Libya, Put, the Arabians, the Sabaeans, and others. We see this characterization most clearly in Isaiah chapter 18 and verse 2. Go, you swift messengers, to a nation tall and smooth, to a people feared near and far, a nation powerful and subjugating, whose land the rivers divide. In passages such as this, Kush is described as a conquering nation with far-reaching reputation for military exploits. The numerical capacity of Kushite armies is also highlighted. For example, in 2 Chronicles 14, we find the story of Zerah the Kushite, who comes up against Judah with an army of 1,000,000 men. 2 Chronicles 16:18 reflects on the same account in this way. Were not the Kushites and the Libyans a great host with exceeding many chariots and horses? Of course, the chronicler's penchant for numerical amplification is well known. Nonetheless, that Zerah has a sizable force, about double the capacity of Judah's army, is what is important for the chronicler. Other biblical examples could be given, but even an Assyrian military report corroborates this biblical perspective. In his 701 campaign against the southern Levant, Sennacherib reported that the rebel leaders of Ekron became afraid and formed an alliance with the kings of Egypt and the archers chariots and horses of the king of the land of Meluhah, forces without number, and they came to their aid. That Sennacherib is exaggerating his opponent's numerical capacity to amplify his own victory is certainly possible. But his report does provide extra biblical support regarding the potential size and strength of southern armies. From the vantage point of the Hebrew Bible and the Assyrian record, Cush as a nation is a powerful military opponent. Its numerical capacity is based on the combination of southern forces of Egyptians and Libyans and Sabaeans, among others. But why does the Hebrew Bible present Cush as a powerful military power? Like Nimrod, Cush as a nation is not being celebrated for its military prowess, except for the sake of amplifying Yahweh's sovereignty over all earthly powers. According to the biblical prophets, ultimately, all earthly powers must either submit to Yahweh their God or experience complete destruction. This is true for Assyrians, Babylonians, Egyptians, and for Kushites. Hence, in the context of Isaiah 18, where Kushites are said to be mighty and conquering, feared near and far, the pericope actually ends with the Kushites' submission to Yahweh. And at that time, gifts will be brought to Yahweh of hosts, from a nation tall and smooth, from a people feared near and far, a nation powerful and subjugating, whose land the rivers divide, to the place of the name of Yahweh of hosts, to Mount Zion. Here the prophet envisions the powerful and mighty Kushites bringing their votive offerings up to Mount Zion in submission to Yahweh, the universal sovereign. Here's another example from Psalm 68. From your temple above Jerusalem, kings bring gifts to you. Nobles will come from Egypt. Cush will hasten to stretch out his hands to God. Nobles of Egypt and Cush are here depicted as bringing their tribute to Yahweh with alacrity. A final but telling example. Thus says Yahweh, the wealth of Cush and the wealth of Egypt and the prophets of Cush and the Sabaeans, men of tall stature, will come over to you and be subject to you. They will seek after you. In chains they shall cross over and bow down to you. They shall make supplication to you, saying, surely God is with you, and besides him there is no other God. So the Hamite nations of Egypt, Cush, and Seba are here portrayed as abjectly subjected to Israel and its God, Yahweh. This theme of the submission of the nations, including Cush, is a dominant one in the prophetic corpus, even if in reality these nations were never at any point subject to Israel. What is important is the ideology of reversal. Rather than Israel being subjected to foreign nations, it is ultimately in Yahweh's purposes for these nations to be subject to Israel and its God. On the other side of the theology of reversal, imperious nations, however militant and powerful, will be completely humiliated by Yahweh. This is typified by the Hebrew Bible's depiction of the complete disarray and humiliating withdrawal of Sennacherib's army following the overnight destruction of 185,000 Assyrian soldiers by the angel of the Lord, as recorded in 2 Kings 19. Not even the mighty Assyrians is any match for Yahweh. Its imperial pride must also be humbled by the God of Israel. This is also true for any imperious nation, including Cush. Israelites are not concerned with the glory of other nations. They are singularly concerned with the honor of Yahweh their God and their claim to be his elect, his unique and special people. So let's take again the story of Zerah the Kushite in 2 Chronicles 14:9 as an example. Though Zerah's army is numerically and technologically superior to Judah's, Zerah is an invader who intends to overwhelm Judah with his superior military power. However, when Asa, king of Judah, with his less numerical army, trusts in Yahweh, his God, the enemy is thoroughly vanquished. Then Asa cried out to Yahweh, his God, Yahweh, there is no difference for you between helping either a multitude or those lacking power. Help us, Yahweh, our God, for we are depending on you. And in your name, we have come out against this multitude. So Yahweh struck the Kushites before Asa and before Judah, and the Kushites fled. And Asa and the people with him pursued them as far as Gerar. and the Kushites fell, so no survivor remained among them, for they had been broken before Yahweh and his camp. The amplification of Zerah's army is designed to magnify even more so the victory of Yahweh over the mighty Kushites. Impossible for Asa and his army, but not so for Yahweh. The key emphasis here is the Israelites' reliance on their God. As 2 Chronicles 16:8, which we've already seen, foregrounds, were not the Kushites and the Libyans a great host with exceeding many chariots and horsemen? Yet, because you relied on Yahweh, he handed them over to you. According to the Hebrew Bible, Yahweh is the one who fights for the Israelites and gives them victory over imperial foes. On the basis of this notion, then, military alliances with foreign peoples are completely disparaged. The Israelites are to rely solely on the power of their God, not on the promise of protection offered by foreign armies. The realpolitik of the period, however, dictated that with a stern hand, the necessity for military alliances as the great powers of North and South competed relentlessly for control of the Levant. Thus, in the context of 701 BC, when Judah under Hezekiah decides to rebel against Assyria and seek the aid of the 25th dynasty, Isaiah's assessment of this alliance is sardonic. Woe to the ones who go down to Egypt for help, who rely on horses, trusting in chariots because they are many, and in horsemen because they are very strong, and look not to the Holy One of Israel, nor seek Yahweh. Woe to the rebellious sons, says Yahweh, who follow advice, but not from me, who seal alliances not sanctioned by my spirit, that they may add sin to sin, who go down to Egypt, though they have not inquired of me, to seek refuge in the strength of Pharaoh, and to take shelter in the shadow of Egypt. Isaiah's rhetoric consistently disparages reliance on Kushite Egypt. He takes a very strong anti-Kushite stance. This alliance, according to Isaiah, will only end in disaster for Judah. For the Egyptians are men and not God, he claims. Their horses are flesh and not spirit. When Yahweh stretches out his hand, both the helper and the one being helped shall fall. All of them will perish together. So will the king of Assyria lead away the prisoners of Egypt and the captives of Cush, young and old, naked and barefooted, with their buttocks uncovered, to the shame of Egypt. Then they will be fearful and ashamed because of Cush, their expectation, and Egypt, their pride. According to Isaiah, Kushite Egypt will be defeated at the hands of the Assyrians, despite their military power, because Assyria is Yahweh's chosen instrument of judgment. Indeed, it is Yahweh himself, according to Isaiah, who will stretch out his hand against the mighty Kushite. However, as I've already pointed out, Assyria too shall fall at Yahweh's appointed time, because it too is impious and oppressive. So whether Cush is an ally, as in the context of 701 BC, or an enemy, such as with Zerah the Kushite, from the perspective of the Hebrew Bible, Cush too must ultimately be subordinated to Yahweh, the God of Israel. Of course, this is a primary reason why the Hebrew Bible gives no credit to the Kushites in the salvation of Jerusalem in 701 BC. Accordingly, Taharka is mentioned in 2 Kings 19:9 only as a passing reference. And he, Sennacherib, heard concerning Taharka, king of Cush, he has come out to fight with you. For the biblical writer, Israel's salvation is effected not by reliance on a foreign army, but by Yahweh himself. So to wrap up the theology surrounding the topical image of mighty Cush, surely Cush is a militant giant in the Hebrew Bible, numerically, technologically, abundant in horses and chariots, and even physically in Isaiah 18. But none of this matters much theologically, except to highlight Yahweh's superior power over Kushites and all imperial powers. Cush may be greater than Israel, but he's no match for Israel's God. Here again, I wish to emphasize that the Hebrew Bible is a religious text, and as such, its representation of Kushites is laden with religious concerns. Specifically, its theology is concerned with the exaltation of Yahweh and his people Israel. The exaltation of the nations, insofar as the nations are to be exalted, is accomplished only in the context of submission to Yahweh and his chosen people, Israel. In this final section, I'd like to explore some historical considerations related to the nature of the 25th dynasty's involvement in Judah in the late 8th century. Of course, the 25th dynasty period is the most important for Kushite involvement in the Levant. There are several instances of Levantine states seeking help from Egypt in the late 8th century. For example, reliefs depicting Sargon's campaign against Levantine cities, including Samaria, shows Kushite soldiers, Kushite Egyptian soldiers, evidently fleeing or being defeated. The so-called Negroid features of these opponents, clean-shaven with tightly curled hair, have long been noted by commentators. The site of Lachish has garnered much attention, especially as of late, and the question of whether Kushite soldiers were present at Lachish or not has been hotly debated. Forensic anthropologists have reached quite different conclusions. Archaeologists excavating in the 1930s uncovered some 1,500 skeletal remains dated to the time of the Assyrian siege in 701. In 1938, British skull expert D.L. Ritson concluded that the skulls were most closely related to those of an upper Egyptian population, particularly those of Kerma, which he concluded meant the inhabitants of Lachish were largely endogamous Upper Egyptians. Soikita's 1988 study or analysis of the Lachish skulls suggested a heterogeneous group of people living at Lachish from diverse geographical origins, including those of North Africa, Egypt, and Nubia, thus confirming the Egypto-Nubian presence. Using a different set of metrics, the 2005 study of Ulinger et al. Concluded, contrary to the two previous studies, that the Lachish population were indigenous to the southern Levant, and thus dismissed the notion of any significant Kushite presence in the Lachish population. A number of interpreters have suggested that Sennacherib's reliefs reveal the presence of Kushites at Lachish, including the image on the left, where of three individuals being impaled. However, two of the leading scholars on Lachish, David Ussishkin and Christoph Ulinger, have both dismissed this view. Ussishkin, for example, indicates that the headdress of one of the individuals on the right who's being impaled represents the plume of a helmet, a decoration consisting of feathers or horsehair. Whereas others, Norma Franklin most recently, argue that since no helmet is discernible on the figure, this plume-like symbol represents a single upright straight feather, similar to those often worn by Kushite soldiers, such as in the relief on the left, depicting Ashurbanipal's attack or sack of Memphis. Thus, in the context of an alliance with Kushite Egypt, the individuals plausibly represent Kushite soldiers, who are especially being harshly treated by the Assyrians. Scholars seem to go back and forth as to whether or not Kushite soldiers were present at Lachish. Recently, Christine Garraway, in her 2020 article, suggests that at least one of the children on the Lachish relief were maybe donning a sidelock, similar to those often shown on Egyptian children, which again may be another indication, in her estimation, of Kushite Egyptian presence in the population of Lachish. In my view, rather than looking at the single site of Lachish for incontrovertible evidence for the presence of Kushites in the late 8th century, a more systematic approach is warranted. A few scholars have recently begun to look more closely at the biblical text for a more broad-based evidence for Kushite influence on Judah in the late 8th century. First, it should be recognized that the period of Kushite rule over Egypt was a time of cultural renaissance and renewal. The Kushite pharaohs unified the Nile Valley and undertook large-scale building activities in both Egypt and Nubia. These activities attest to an economic boom during this period. The capital of the empire was relocated to Memphis, ensuring not only more hands-on oversight of Lower Egypt, but also a means to check Assyrians' influence in the southern Levant. The Kushite pharaohs resided at Memphis, much closer to Jerusalem than his distant former capital of Napata. From this locality, the pharaoh is better able to influence affairs in the Levant. Thus, Hezekiah forms an alliance with the Kushite pharaoh with the royal house at Memphis. The alliance with Judah is of course one of vassalage. Judah is a vassal state of Kushite Egypt, with the royal house very close at Memphis. The Kushites are in the driver's seat of this vassalage relationship. Compared to Judah, Egypt was the dominant cultural sphere at this time, which would be naturally attractive to Judeans. Judah necessarily sought to emulate this dominant culture. Importantly, vassalage implied wide-ranging influence of the overlord on the vassal state. These influences traverse many areas: politics, economics, culture, religious, among others. Let's take a look at a couple of these in turn. Professor Pope's presentation a few weeks ago emphasized the value of Kushite war horses across the ancient Near East. These horses were sought after as chariot horses from the Levant all the way to Assyria. Kushite equestrian experts are attested in Assyria and were no doubt present in Samaria, as several scholars have suggested. In the time of Hezekiah, Lachish was the primary military stronghold of Judah, with a sizable and permanent chariot force. That Kushite horses were the core of that defensive system, with southern equestrian experts at hand at a time when Hezekiah is a vassal of Memphis, is not only plausible, but highly likely. Both the Assyrian Rabshakeh and Isaiah make it abundantly clear that Hezekiah is depending on Kushite Egypt for horses and chariots. Hezekiah's chariot force at Lachish would likely be supplied and potentially overseen by Kushites. Beyond war horses and chariots, southern goods like ivory, ebony, and elephant hide were sought after by Levantine states. According to Sennacherib, among the payment Hezekiah sends to him at Nineveh were large blocks of ivory beds, armchairs of ivory, elephant hides, ivory, or ebony. Such items were without a doubt obtained from the south, attesting to the burgeoning of Kushite trade in this region. As Jeremy Pope has emphasized, a primary interest of the Kushite pharaohs was maintaining strong trading relationships with the Levant. There are other important indicators of Egyptian Kushite influence on economic affairs in the Levant at this time. For instance, Judah adopts the Egyptian shekel weight system in the late 8th century. Why? But to better facilitate trading relations with Egypt. Hezekiah is aligning Judah's measuring system to that of Egypt in order to take full advantage of the booming trade from the south. This adoption of the Egyptian norm is another indication of the more systemic influence of the overlord upon the vassal state. Other aspects of this broad-based Egyptian Kushite influence in the late 8th century can also be shown. Many Judean seals containing Egyptian iconography attest to Egyptian influence in Judah in the late 8th century. Of significance, the Egyptian two-winged scarab beetle, such as this Phaon scarab, which represents the unification of the two lands, Upper and Lower Egypt, shows up in an important context. Hezekiah, king of Judah, specifically adopts this winged sun disk symbolism, well attested in the Kushite period, as his official emblem, as can be seen by his royal seal here, which reads, belonging to Hezekiah, king of Judah, son of Ahaz. This Egyptian iconography, important to the pharaohs, is directly borrowed by Hezekiah, again, to further associate his administration and his kingdom with a powerful Egyptian center. He makes widespread use of this symbolism, including on jars used to store supplies in preparation for the Assyrian siege. About 1,000 of these lamelech belonging to the king, jar handles, have been recovered, stamped with Hezekiah's winged scarab seal. Hezekiah's adoption of the winged scarab is but another indication of Judah's emulation of the dominant culture. Some scholars suggest that Hezekiah adopts this symbolism, stripped it of its religious significance, and employed it for the purpose of inscribing his own political ambitions, the unification of the two lands, Israel and Judah. But others argue that this royal emblem did in fact hold religious meaning for Hezekiah. The winged disc, traditionally associated with the Egyptian sun god Horus, comes to symbolize Yahweh for Hezekiah, a deity who resembles Horus due to his association with wings, solar features, and the verb to be with his name. Is Kushite Egypt exerting religious influence in Judah? Christopher Hayes suggests the same. He argues at length that the iconography of the goddess Mut, whose amulets have been found at many Levantine sites, including Lachish, is a point of contestation in Isaiah. Mut was well known and worshipped in the Levant in the Iron Age. Isaiah's castigation of the Judean leaders for making a covenant with death is an allusion to Judean leaders' ritual worship of Mut, an important deity in the Kushite pantheon. The Hebrew word Mut, death, and the Egyptian name for the goddess are similar in sound and spelling. This type of wordplay is common in Hebrew prophetic oracles. So according to Hayes, this passage reveals Isaiah's denunciation of the alliance or covenant with Kushite Egypt. Hayes' argument, in my view, is highly plausible, given Isaiah's strong anti-Kushite stance elsewhere in the book. Thus, Kushite Egypt's influence also reaches into the Judean religious sphere. Similarly and saliently, a series of 4 or 5 elaborate Egyptian-style tombs in the necropolis of Silwan in Jerusalem further reveals Kushite influence in 8th century Jerusalem. These 4 tombs, all topped with Egyptian-style pyramids, similar to Kushite royal tombs, though no longer extant, and inscribed with Hebrew inscriptions, reveal a strong Egyptianizing influence in late 8th century Jerusalem. The most famous of these tombs, seen here, has traditionally been called the Tomb of Pharaoh's Daughter, in reference to Solomon's wife. The Tomb of Pharaoh's Daughter and the others are now securely dated to the late 8th century, not the time of Solomon, but the time of Hezekiah. Tomb 35 has the inscription, Tomb of the Royal Steward. It is identified by archaeologists as the tomb of Shebna, Hezekiah's royal steward. Franklin, following Hayes, argues that Isaiah's vitriol against Shebna, the secretary, reveals Isaiah's staunch opposition to Kushite influence in Jerusalem. Isaiah 22:15-19 castigates Shebna for carving an ostentatious rock-hewn tomb for himself. Franklin suggests that Shebna is either a Kushite official living in Jerusalem or a pro-Kushite Judean leader who has firmly embraced the Kushite way. Hence, Isaiah's invective against Shebna is consistent with a strong anti-Kushite stance in Isaiah 1-40. These Egyptian-style tombs add more evidence for the broad-based Kushite presence and influence in Jerusalem in the time of Hezekiah. So in conclusion, rather than making Lachish the location or the locus of contention for the Kushite presence in Judah, I believe the argument that identifies a systemic and pervasive Kushite influence in multiple spheres of Judean life is well sustained, from politics to economics to religion to the social arena. Hezekiah is not only firmly aligned with the Kushite dynasty, but he's also enamored by this revitalized Egyptian culture under the Kushite pharaohs. Under Hezekiah, Kushites multiply in Judah and Jerusalem, leaving an enduring presence in Judah well beyond the time of Hezekiah. Indeed, the prophet Zephaniah, writing some 60 to 80 years after the time of Hezekiah, unequivocally traces his lineage 3 generations back to Hezekiah. The word of the Lord came to Zephaniah, the son of Cushi, son of Gedaliah, son of Amariah, son of Hezekiah, in the days of Josiah, son of Ammon of Judah. Why does he trace his lineage 3 generations back? Unique in all the prophetic literature, except to legitimize his right to speak prophetically to Judeans. He's seeking to establish his roots in Judean society by appealing to his royal lineage. Hezekiah is my great-great-grandfather. But he also says his father is Cushi. Whether a proper name, Cushi, or a gentilic, the Kushite, it is clear that Zephaniah is Judean, descended of royal blood, and is also of Kushite ancestry. That Cushi had become a proper name in the time of Zephaniah and Jeremiah is indicative of a persisting presence of Kushites in Jerusalem. Zephaniah mentions Cush 2 other places in his prophecy, including the following: "From beyond the rivers of Cush, my worshippers, the daughters of my dispersed ones, shall bring mine offering." Zephaniah suggests that a Judean diaspora exists in Cush, which will in turn return to Zion. That Zephaniah is prophesying about Cush after the 25th dynasty had ceased to rule Egypt and traces his lineage to Hezekiah reveals the abiding presence of Kushites in Judean society, beginning particularly with Hezekiah. Hence the reason why Jeremiah could speak in such a matter-of-fact manner about the Kushite skin. Can a Kushite change his skin, or the leopard his spots? Not only was Jeremiah familiar with Kushites in the royal court, one of whom, Ebed-Melech, saved him from certain death, but his audience as well needed no explanation of who a Kushite was or the salience of the skin metaphor. So, some concluding thoughts. The biblical writers represent Cush as a militant and mighty people with far-reaching reputation for military conquest. But this depiction is not meant as a celebration of Kushite military or political power. The Hebrew Bible makes moral theological judgment of Cush and all other foreign nations on the basis of their relationship to Yahweh. Cush stands as a topical symbol of military strength for the purpose of glorifying Yahweh and his people Israel. Thus, whether friend or foe, whether mighty or weak, in the theology of the Hebrew Bible, Cush, like all other nations, must in the end be subjected to Yahweh and his people Israel, or be destroyed. From a historical point of view, the 25th dynasty left a lasting influence on Judean politics and culture that resounded till the very end of the end of the kingdom of Judah in the early 6th century. This systemic influence, seen by Hezekiah's enthusiastic embrace and adoption of Egyptian culture and standards, removes the focus from Lachish as the primary site to contend for the Kushite present in 8th century Judah. The influence of the Double Kingdom on Judah was systemic and pervasive. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Burrell, for a fascinating talk. I do have some questions for you. Actually, you answered a lot of my own questions as you were presenting. So part of what I'm asking might be rehashing a little bit, but
Sure.
Elaborating on some topics. So you mentioned that the term Cush or related terms appear 62 times in the Hebrew Bible across a variety of contexts, from Genesis to Isaiah to Kings to Chronicles. So the first question is, are there patterns in terms of the frequency with which the term appears in certain parts of the text? And are there patterns in terms of the biblical perspective on Cush that's related to when in time that text was composed?
Yeah, I mean, the question of textual composition is an ongoing debate in biblical studies. I tend to focus on the text in terms of the history or the historical context that it presents. I don't spend a lot of time trying to decipher when exactly the text was written. I do that for most texts. Some are necessary for me to explore when a particular text was written, depending on how it's describing Cush. In terms of pattern, it is difficult to say. I think, in terms of aligning composition with the image of Cush. So, for example, were Kushites seen as mighty and powerful during the 25th dynasty and texts that are associated with the 25th dynasty period, or are Kushites across the board, irrespective of the time of composition, seen as mighty and powerful? And I would suggest the latter, because if we look at some texts, such as we know Chronicles, for example, is written in the Persian period. If we look at Chronicles at the end of the 5th century, early 4th century composition, it's speaking of Zerah, the mighty Kushite. And so this is long after Kush had ceased to be a world power. And so in many ways, it's difficult for me to align, the 25th dynasty period as defining the role of Kushites for the rest of the Hebrew Bible. But in any case, I do think that Cush, from the perspective of the biblical authors, because they were familiar with Kushites throughout all periods, Cush has this militant imagery, this very positive militant image. But I said positive from our perspective, not from the Hebrew Bible's perspective, which is they're not enthused about imperialists and those who want to oppress them. So I hope I answered your question somewhat.
Yeah, you did. Thank you. Another question, could you comment a bit more or elaborate on what seems to be this gap between the emulation of Kushite Egyptian culture in Judah on the one hand, which seems to imply a positive Judean view of Kushites with the example of Hezekiah's stamp seal that you showed us, and then on the other hand, the negative portrayal of Kushites in the Hebrew Bible in passages about that same time, about the time of Hezekiah. So both sources seem to reflect the perspectives of the literate elite of society. So what's the explanation behind this big difference?
Really good question. Yeah, really good question. The prophetic perspective is the one that castigates the relationship between Cush and Judah. So Isaiah, as the prophetic voice, who is the pro-Yahwistic voice, is speaking out against any kind of political alliance. And particularly because in Isaiah's view, or the way he spins it, is that Assyria is Yahweh's instrument of judgment. So any alignment with Kushite Egypt is going to spell disaster for Judah. And so he's concerned about his people and he's concerned about their welfare, insofar as we're taking Isaiah 1-40 as specifically written by an individual at that time. So he's concerned about his people and their welfare. And so he sees this as contrary to what the Judean leadership should be doing. They should be trusting in Yahweh, their God. Essentially, he's pro-Assyrian. He's basically saying, stick with Assyria. Don't go to these guys because it's going to spell disaster for you. So we do have contrasting views of Kushites within that context. You're right, that on the one hand, the realpolitik demonstrates that, it was necessary for Judah, a small, kingdom in the midst of two vying superpowers, to resort to one of these guys for protection. And so, in fact, we have differing views of Hezekiah himself. On the one hand, Hezekiah is seen as an instrument of faith who trusts in Yahweh, his God. He does not, in fact, one view sees Hezekiah's rebellion against Assyria as a good thing. He rebelled against Assyria and the God was with him. But if you read Isaiah, on the other hand, it's a bad thing. So even within the biblical text, there's contrasting views about Hezekiah himself and his policies, right? And so the same is true of Cush. Now, they're not singling out Cush because of Cush Egypt. It's just the idea of aligning yourself with an imperial power that's seen as an oppressor. So whether it's Cush or it's Babylon or any of these, it's the idea of trusting in a foreign power is strongly disparaged.
Okay, thank you. So this question is coming in from Solange Ashby, who asks, is there any extra biblical evidence for Zerah the Kushite?
It's a really great question. Fantastic question. The Zerah the Kushite is problematic in terms of the historical evidence simply because he is in the late 10th, early 9th century, historically speaking, in the time of Asa. But one of the evidence that I find extremely fascinating is the fact that a number of Egyptologists have suggested that there was within this early period in Nubia certain power centers, such as evidenced by Queen Katamala at Semna West, and the number of Neo-Ramesside kings that have been redated to that same early 10th, 9th century period. And associated with Katamala, they're suggesting, in a word, that there were powerful centers of Kushite influence in Nubia during the Libyan period, the Third Intermediate period. So, in other words, Zerah the Kushite, one could make reference to this evidence that there was indeed powerful centers in Nubia in this early period, potentially, because our knowledge of the Third Intermediate period is quite fragmentary. But based on Katamala, based on this redating of these kings, Neo-Ramesside kings, we can see some kind of power center in Nubia during that Third Intermediate period. Do they have the power and capacity to bypass Egypt to go all the way into southern Judah to make an invasion? Possibly. I mean, we do have the example of Pa-Nehesi in the 20th dynasty in the time of Ramses XI, who actually invades Egypt and basically was in the north, in the Delta, for several years before he was driven back to Nubia. Okay, this is, of course, Pa-Nehesi is the viceroy of Kush at this particular period. So if he is invading Egypt with his Nubian army, and some scholars believe he was seeking to liberate Nubia from Egyptian imperialism at this point, then we have a possible scenario of strong enough Kushite power that could penetrate Egypt and even go as far, potentially, as Judah. So I think there is some measure of corroboration there, at least plausibly, that there is power centers in Nubia that could effect this kind of invasion of Judah.
Okay, thank you. So speaking of Kushite power, is there a reason that seems to be sort of consistent among the great foreign conquerors like the Assyrians and Babylonians in terms of their difficulty defeating and subjugating Nubia in their own land or going up against the Kushite military? You mentioned they have horses and the cavalry and the military might. Are there any other specifics that you could add to that?
The Kushites are technologically advanced, no question, compared to Judah. But in terms of Assyria, as Professor Pope's presentation a few weeks ago demonstrated, the Kushites founder quite a bit with Assyrian power. Eventually, I mean, they certainly compete with them, and particularly after 701, Sennacherib claims a grand victory. But we know from the evidence that Kushites were very much involved in the Levant subsequent to that. It's not until the reign of his son Esarhaddon, some 25 years later, where Assyria begins to push west again and dominate that region. So Kushite power stave off Assyrian onslaught for a while, but eventually Assyria gains the upper hand, even invading Egypt and expelling the Kushites from Egypt ultimately, right? So both from Memphis, Taharka's residence, his city is ransacked, his son is taken, and the entire royal house is captured by Esarhaddon. And later Ashurbanipal sacks Memphis again and all the way to Thebes. And so according to the Assyrian record, they basically uproot the seed of Kush from Egypt. And so if it were not for the Assyrians, we would have had, the history might have been written quite differently in terms of the Kushite presence in Egypt. So the Assyrians turn out won the day ultimately in terms of their effectiveness against the Kushites.
Okay, well, another question that's related to the Assyrians. So your talk presented a few art historical examples of Kushites appearing on Neo-Assyrian reliefs. Are there any figural depictions of Kushites that survive in the archaeological record of ancient Israel as opposed to ancient Mesopotamia? And if so, how are they depicted? And is the depiction consistent with biblical characterizations?
Yeah, good question. No, not that I'm aware of in terms of ancient Israel. No pictorial or iconographic remnants or remains. All we have are textual. And so we just go based on the text in the Hebrew Bible and compare what they've written about Kushites with surrounding cultures, Egypt, Assyria, just to kind of get a picture of, a comparative picture of Kushites. So no, the short answer, we have none of those records beyond within the Hebrew Bible, unfortunately, or within the ancient Israel or Judah.
Yeah, I'm not too surprised to hear that. It does tend to be a scanty art historical record. So
yeah.
In terms of a sort of a bigger picture question about biblical portrayals of other people and otherness, are there external nations, are all external nations, external from Israel, equally separate from the people of Israel, or are some othered in more intensive ways or in different ways? I could rephrase that if you need me to.
Yeah, I think I understand the question. I think all nations are judged, as I've said, on the basis of their relationship to Israel's God. So if a nation is acting in favor of Israel's God, then they are incorporated into Israel, they have a positive view of that nation. So for example, the Kenites who assist Moses in the wilderness, they become part of they become part of the chosen people, essentially, and invited to be part of, to enter the promised land. So Israel has a positive view of peoples that are particularly at we call the day-to-day level, the individual level. But at the national level, in general, most nations are Israel's enemies, right? So they're trying to conquer them, or they're either being subjected, so they're either supposed to be subjected or destroyed in many respects. So the Hebrew Bible has an ethno-religious characterization of people, not based on color, not based on nationality per se, but based on the relationship of that nation to Yahweh, Israel's God. And of course, Israel stood out largely as a monotheistic nation. So therefore, most of everyone else will be considered unclean, will be considered, idolatrous. And so they are not in line with Yahweh's will. And so, but again, at the individual level, we see where any individual who comes to trust in Yahweh is treated quite positively, such as Ebed-Melech the Kushite, who has a very positive portrait in the book of Jeremiah, because as Jeremiah says, he has come to trust in Yahweh. Or we can see Moses' Kushite wife in Numbers chapter 12, where she is basically Yahweh stands up for her, right? He defends the right of Moses to marry this Kushite woman who is obviously a Yahwistic worshiper. And so we see where any foreign peoples that are subject to Yahweh are favorably understood or favorably portrayed in the text. But again, the opposite is not true if you don't trust in the God of Israel. And again, I emphasize this is a theological document. So it's a ethno-religious construction of identity. That's the basis of othering in the Hebrew Bible, not based on biology per se, except in the context of genealogy, where genealogy is associated with Yahweh or peoples who follow Yahweh. But it's an ethno-religious construction of identity, not one that's biological or racial.
Right. Okay. Thank you. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Now, there is an audience question that is related to what you were just talking about with Moses' Kushite wife. So you may have already touched on the answer to this, but I'll ask it anyway. The question is, what is the significance of God afflicting Miriam through the episode of her castigating Moses for his Kushite wife?
Yeah, that's an interesting one, because a lot of commentators have seen some measure of poetic justice in Miriam's skin becoming white as snow. Some even asserting, that Miriam, so the leprosy is simply, God spinning the tail. So she's disparaging Moses' Kushite wife because of the darkness of her skin. And so therefore Yahweh, curses her with a skin disease and so on. Others see this as an issue of exogamy. So Moses being married to a foreigner as opposed to a Black woman per se. So it's an issue of exogamy, which is quite strongly denounced in the biblical text, at least in many places. So Moses here is, so it's a matter of which point you want to take, because if it's the skin issue, then the salience of some measure of physical differentiation becomes important. And so we can say Israel had some kind of a racialist vision of the Kushite, or we can say it is actually exogamy that is the issue here. And more importantly, exogamy becomes a pretext for Miriam and Aaron to challenge Moses' spiritual authority. So it's really using exogamy, because if elsewhere the scripture, or elsewhere the texts, or elsewhere the Yahweh disparages exogamous marriages and Moses is married to this foreigner, then his spiritual authority is compromised. So I tend to see it at the latter, because I don't see where ancient Israel had any kind of developed, any kind of develop antipathy against Black skin or dark skin pigmentation. Again, because many within Israel from the earliest period would also have this characteristic, dark skin.
Okay, thank you so much. Well, we're just about out of time here, so I think we'll go ahead and wrap it up. So I think that concludes the lecture and the question and answer segment for today. Thank you so much, Dr. Kevin Burrell, for sharing your time and expertise with us and with the wider public. Thank you to the viewers for their interest in scholarship and history, and for everyone's efforts collectively to engage in reconceptualizing the past. I want to put in a plug for our final presentation of this series, so please join us if you can for the next New Perspective on Ancient Nubia lecture, brought to you by the Badè Museum in ARF, which is scheduled for June 3rd at noon Pacific time. So thank you so much again.